So today when we're looking at the soup, a few basic things. We're lucky enough within the recipe, I have sweet corn kernels listed as the corn that we would normally use. I've had a friend who's come back from Ganawage and has brought back actual wide hominy corn, something that we wouldn't see is readily available in the grocery store. Why? There's no real reason why yet. A lot of it is used inside of Mexican cuisine, so a lot of Latin specific specialty stores would carry canned hominy, but this is actual real fresh hominy corn that we're going to be using today that's been lied and treated, so it's actually edible, okay? And the treatment could take like 3 days worth of time to actually properly produce and to work with, and it is considered a very traditional skill amongst some of our knowledge keepers in regards to food. We're lucky to have this corn today. In the recipe, it says white beans. I'm deciding to jazz it up because it's so corny out and crummy out. I've decided to go with a 6-bean blend. 6-bean blend in itself, good for fiber, good nutrition, good digestion when you're doing this. But a couple of quick things before we start actually cutting and working on anything. I always tell people when you're first starting in the kitchen, secure your cutting boards. So a quick little thing, cheap little mesh drawer liner from the dollar store. Underneath your cutting board is going to stop it from sliding around. Okay, that down first, and then obviously your cutting board goes next. And this stops your cutting board from moving whatsoever. And I'm going to adjust my camera so that you can actually see a little bit more into my counter. You can actually see I've got the recipe taped up to the wall here. But as you can see, the cutting board's safe and secure and won't move very much. That's going to help you if you're cutting and your board's moving all over the place. You're chasing your item with your knife, and you don't want to be doing that. You want to make sure that everything is stable and secure. I keep a little pastry bench scraper handy, great for picking up on the counter, putting things into a mixing bowl or moving things out of the way if you need to. I've got salt and pepper handy. In my kitchen, we always keep salt and pepper in big bins because I usually use quite a bit. I've got canola oil. A lot of people argue, can you use olive oil? No, don't use olive oil. Olive oil is meant to dress salads. Olive oil is meant as a finishing oil, not as a cooking oil. You need something that gets to a higher smoke point. When you take olive oil to a 230-degree smoke point, which is its absolute highest property that it can do, it will actually start to burn. The flavor of it will change, and it will change whatever you're working with. Canola oil can reach up to 540 degrees safely. If your stove pumps that hot, just control your heat, okay? Some people will be cooking on gas and it's possible to get that high. I would suggest to people just to bring it down a little bit. And I've got a pot. I'm making a larger batch of this soup. The soup in itself and from the recipe produces about 300 milliliters. So if you want to make a liter of it, you could triple it up. It's not very difficult to do. I've used water in mine because that's how we would traditionally use it within my community. And thyme is also can be substituted with rosemary. I use olive oil for everything. You know what? It's okay. These are the kind of things that, you know, I talk about with my culinary students. I see them, we put out oils and salts on the very first day of class, and I always see them reaching for olive oil. They're like, I want it healthier for you. I'm like, I've been a chef for so long, I don't need health anymore. I want flavor. Give me the salt, give me all the pepper, give me all the oil that you can without making it greasy, and let's have fun. And that's the important thing about working on this recipe when we're cooking. I tell people not to cook with stress. Cook and have fun. That's what it's about. Because when you're in the kitchen and it's you in your own little space, like I've got my own little space here, and as you can see, I've got a myriad of little tools up here on the wall. This is like my little home, and I've got a good little knife rack on the wall. The only knife that you will need for all of this is a chef's knife. Simple and easy. Make sure it's sharp. And you're supposed to pull through sharpeners to actually get somebody to sharpen your knife and take care of it. Running it up and down the rod does not sharpen your blade. That just hones the edge and brings it back. But just a simple little chef's knife in itself will do you just fine. Nothing really extravagant or expensive inside of this kitchen. I've got a bag full of knives that I use for other days in my role at the National Arts Center. So first things first, before we cook, we prep. And when we prep, what we're doing is we're preparing ourselves to actually be able to make the dish and produce the dish all in one fell swoop. You don't want to be running around having cut carrots and cut squash and trying to add everything to the pot. No, you're in control of the pot. And one of the most important things to remember is you control what goes into it and you control the heat. So if the pot's on the stove and things are getting too hot, take it off the element. I'm using electric in my house, so electric, excuse me. Unfortunately, our zoning doesn't allow gas in this area, so everything has to be electric. I miss gas at home. But the reality to remember is when you've got a pot on the stove, it gets too hot, take it off the heat, allow it to cool down, and then continue. That's as simple as that. There's no race to get dinner on the table. You can take the time to cook and spend a little bit of time doing it properly, and all will turn out well. As well too, little bowl, compost bowl. I have a bowl that as we're working through on things and we're cutting stuff, I will add to it so that I can compost it properly. I believe wholeheartedly that we need to be thinking about the future and our environment. And as in my role as an Indigenous educator, this is something that we talk about in depth with our students, is about making sure that we are recycling where we can, composting where we can, and trying to save that food waste and turn it into something productive that helps with the growing or could help with the Three Sisters. We have the Three Sisters Garden at Algonquin College that was conceived by Jeffrey Turner, and next year the students in the Indigenous program will be doing all of the planting, harvesting, and working with that, and working with community initiatives to produce that for other organizations such as the women's shelters with the Mission and Chef Rick's. There's a discussion about collaborative with that. We're trying to reach out and find the best ways to make sure that our harvest is used that way. So in order to have a good harvest, we need good compost, and our students are always asking, what do we do with compost? And it's like the school horticultural department will handle that from us. So first things first, we need to peel some carrots. Okay, so we're going to get a couple of carrots. I'm going to use just normal, everyday orange carrots, nothing like that. Like that. Thumbs up, Chef Rick. Yes, agreed. His new social enterprise and giving back to the community is fantastic. And that's something that I want my students to be aligned with, because there are a lot of Indigenous population that are utilizing not just the Indigenous Pre-Apprenticeship Program. I'm always asked, what does it cost the students? It's absolutely free. Like I do the legwork to apply for the funding to be able to host at Algonquin College. Right now we have our students in level 1, and then they go into work placement in January. And from there, I hope to wave goodbye and wish them good luck on a new job, because that's what it's supposed to be. Get them trained and get them out there and get them working in their field respectively. People that are passionate about food, they learned about their culture, they learned about their food, they learned about their food culture while studying with me, and now they're sharing that with everybody else in the communities and the people around them. And they're doing a lot of different little events here and there. We've got a couple more coming up in after December and January, and we're hoping to be pushing those out there for everybody. So we're going to peel carrots first. No right or wrong way to peel a carrot. I've got a simple little Y peeler. I'm just going to peel my carrots, and I'm going to save those trims so they can all go to compost. You can use the city compost program. You can start your own little composter in the backyard, whatever you may wish, but I always ask, please don't throw it in the trash. There's no reason to be doing that, especially in this day and age. In our job at the NAC, I'm a chef de partie that oversees our banqueting departments, and we have what's called an ORCA system. It's a system that will recycle and turn any and all foods into clear water that can be used within the building for warewashing and such. So it actually puts a 40% reduction on the amount of water used by our dishwashers in all parts of the building. And that may not sound like a lot, but when we're serving 3,000 to 4,000 people in a day, that's a significant amount. So peeling carrots, no right or wrong way. Okay, just make sure that we get them all nice and cleaned up. We'll do the trimming afterwards. You trim up your end pieces a little bit afterwards, but first things first, we want to peel, get everything sort of all set and ready to go. There. Simple and easy. I'm putting them off to the side for now. I've got my palmy corn and beans already set, so I'm going to put them away off to the side. Zucchini. I've got yellow zucchini here. And everybody always asks, do I peel zucchini? No. The skin on zucchini has a nutritional value. It has added flavor to it. There's no reason to get rid of it. It's kind of like, I never understood when people peel potatoes and throw away the skins. For myself, I'm always quite amazed by that. I'm like, why are we throwing this away? It shouldn't be, just leave it on there. So for zucchini, when you're looking at it, it's got two ends. So obviously this is the vine end, the very top. This would be attached to the vine. You want to remove that. A lot of people cut off this little butt on the bottom, and you can actually leave that there. There's nothing wrong with that being there, because that was actually part of the flower. At one point, when the flower actually was blossoming, it was blossoming right from here. So that's okay to leave in, because it will still break down and it's still edible. You can cut it off if you don't want it there, but honestly, I don't see the reason to take it away. So I'm just going to take it. I'm going to trim off that little end piece, get my vegetables ready. We've got our butternut squash. This is where you need to have a little bit of elbow grease. I chose butternut because this is the time of year for it. I really like butternut squash a lot too. Acorn squash is nice, but I feel like butternut's like kind of the all-star of the squash world. He doesn't get enough play out there. So I was like, we're going to have butternut squash today. Is this local? Absolutely. I try and get as much of my produce locally as possible, because I want to be able to support our local farmers. And as we all know, we're still running through a pandemic, and we're just coming out the other side. And we need to make sure that our industry and our areas and our people that are running it are supported. And that's a big thing for me. especially with our students as well too. We talk a lot about farming and farming communities and Indigenous farms, hopefully one day being at the forefront. In order for that to work, we need to support our local farms that are here now so we can create other infrastructure to invite other farmers to join the mix. So squash, you could peel it with your peeler. My peeler is not strong enough, so I'm going to be using my knife, but I'm going to do it very, very carefully. You need a little bit of strength behind taking down your butternut squash. One of the things that I always tell people when they're cutting as well too, is a safe way to cut and not cut. Hands flat like this and out is not the way to do it. We tuck our knife always right in on its side like that. We want to make sure that the blade is following up and down. If you cut in here, it's going to hurt. It will bleed a little bit, but less so than if you were to cut the tips of your fingers. You got the tips of your fingers, it's the very end of the extremity, the blood is falling down and coming back up. And from a first aid standpoint, it's also more commonly to get infections in the tips of your fingers or your thumbs when you're cut, as opposed to the front. First few weeks of culinary school are always a nightmare. I have like a bowl like this full of Band-Aids and a bowl like this full of rubber finger cots. And usually when I get first year, first semester students, or even my Indigenous students, it's always hand goes up and chef, I need another Band-Aid, please. And it's kind of funny. So when we're at home, I'm assuming most of you cook for yourselves now, and this isn't the first time you're seeing someone cook for you. We just make sure that we're a little bit safer. For me, I'm going to see if I can't knock the end of that off. Sometimes it's not going to come off, so I just cut. I'm holding and gripping firmly and applying force coming down. And there we go. And I'm not going to use the whole squash because I only need so much for the soup. So I'm going to take what we call the fillet part, or the filet mignon part. The part that's got no seeds, you don't have to fight with, and it's actually a really good part. This part's got seeds and it's awkward to cut, and sometimes it's annoying. And so today I don't feel like being annoyed by this half, but I'm going to save it for later because we have vegetarians in my home that eat only vegetables. Some of us eat meat, but this is nice when you just roast it in the oven with just simple, no even salt or pepper, just a little bit of fresh sumac, Ontario sumac on the top, and it gets this really tart flavor. So we can put this off to the side. When I'm peeling my squash, I'm tucking my fingers again nice and tight and moving down across the skin just to remove thin pieces. So as you look at it, you can see there's not a lot of squash in there, and it's a very, very thin cut. It may not look like it may look like it's really easy to do, but I've been doing this for a long time. So if yours looks a little butchered, please do not feel badly. We're not here to make anybody feel badly about skills. We're here to cook and have some fun. So I'm going to just go through, and I'm just going to peel off the outer edges. And when you're doing that, what you're doing is you're exposing nice soft flesh. It's going to get a little slippery. And if you find that's too slippery for you, a simple kitchen towel around and tucked on there will also help it from sliding all over the place. These are little tips that I pick up along the way, or have noticed along the way, especially when I'm doing large amounts of vegetable. We just did an event the other night where we had Joseph Schwana as our visiting guest at Chef's Table at the National Arts Center, and we did squash for close to 1,000 people over 3 days. So my towels were very squashy by the end, but we needed that, and we needed that squash to be representative. So again, peels into my little compost bowl off camera now, and there we go. Nice and peeled on the outside, it's all ready to go. It's kind of got a little bit of a really obtuse octagon shape to it, but it'll be perfect for the soup in itself. So I've got my carrots, I've got my zucchini. Okay, onions. Everybody always says, how do you cut onions without crying? There's a million tricks. My favorite one I used to do, and I'll let you in a little anecdote, is I used to give all my first year students a piece of white bread on their tray with onions. I tell them, if you chew the bread at the same time while you're cutting onions, you won't cry. And it was just entertaining. It's not, it has no truth to it whatsoever. You just see people there trying to cut and they're chewing bread at the same time. Honestly, the only way to really stop the onions from making you cry is well ventilation inside of your kitchen, making sure that you have good airflow. So if you open your windows, because what's causing the crying is when people cut this little end off, okay? This little end on the end is keeping all the fibers intact with your onion. When you remove that end, the fibers create a mist in the air, and that mist is an irritant for your eyes. It is actually an onion's last line of defense after it's been pulled out of the ground to not being consumed. Cut very much like bell peppers containing seeds. Birds can't burp, they eat the seeds inside of the pepper, and it causes like severe indigestion and upset for a bird. This is its way of kind of protecting itself from anything that might be scavenging for it. If we're doing the soup, I've got 2 onions handy. I always keep 2 handy. Sometimes when you open an onion in the inside, like everybody says, an onion has many layers. It might not be so nice in the inside and the center. So if it's not good, we just want to be able to discard it. I don't want to have to run around for another onion, so I've got 2 here just in case. So I'm going to keep that end piece intact. I'm going to remove the top. And take a look. My onion's beautiful on the inside, so I don't need the extra onion, so it can leave my workspace. And that's what I try and do as I'm cooking. I try and break down my workspace as we go. The more clutter you have around, the harder it is. And as you can see, I don't have a giant sized kitchen. I have a smaller residential kitchen in an older home, so I try and make the best use of my space when I'm here. So I've got the onion. I'm going to take it. I'm going to cut right in half on the onion. Then we'll pick up, obviously, my compost bowl. And I look for outer layer and remove the outer layer. And if it's a little bit thicker a piece, that's okay. I'm going to take that. And same on this side as well too. So now that it's peeled, I'm not going to cut it right yet. Onions are the last thing I always kind of cut traditionally. As many of my chefs have told me, when you're cutting onions, make it the last thing that you want to cut, because you can go directly from the board to the pot. And when I go directly from the board to the pot, I will most likely get rid of my board. Not always though, because today we have fresh herbs. So I've got rosemary in lieu of thyme. It looks like it's pretty beat up. It's just a little bent over from resting in my fridge. I'm going to make a little bundle out of it, because inside of there, I've suggested that people tie it together, and then they tie the string to the edge of the pot so it's easy to remove. If you tie it together, you can also snatch it out with a pair of tongs, or if you're like myself, I use chopsticks when I'm cooking a lot. I'll remove it just quickly from that. A little less impact, especially when you're working with meats and you're working with delicate things. Chopsticks, when you're pretty proficient with it, is light pressure. It's the amount of pressure you put on it. When you grab it with a pair of tongs, it's got a spring in it, so it's causing an immense amount of pressure and crushing what you're working with. So I'm going to use that, and I have some fresh thyme from my Three Sisters garden, or sorry, sage, excuse me. I was thinking about the time. I'm going to add this in the end. Remember, fresh herbs are always added to the end of the dish or in a liquid form, like we're doing right now with the soup. They're used as flavoring and then removed. Okay. When you're finishing a dish, you want to finish with what flavors you really want to stand out. So I want the sage to stand out, because sage is very, very inherently an indigenous cooking herb. And as well, this time of year, it's part of our fall harvest. Many people just finished celebrating Thanksgiving, lots of turkey and everything else. And as you know, it's a mixed bag on those that celebrate within the Indigenous community. I myself wish everybody happy Thanksgiving, but myself, I don't support it in the sense of having a turkey. But what I do recognize is that the month of October is our harvest month, especially within the Iroquois Confederacy. And as a member of that and a member of the Mohawks community, this month is known as Okiwe, or Festival of the Parting, meaning things are starting to pass on. We see the leaves changing color, we see vegetables changing, and becoming bigger and plumper, and our squashes are there. So it's a time to celebrate for harvests. And this soup is very important to show that connection that Indigenous people have with Earth, in the sense that we were hunter-gatherers. And a lot of people think that Indigenous food is venison and buffalo and bison and all these big meat meals. But we were very much into agriculture far before we were into that. If anybody can think of it in this day and age, and if anybody has ever been hunting or knows about hunting, when you go deer hunting, it is a very big undertaking. You have to be super quiet out in the forest. And I have been hunting both traditional and in the non-traditional sense. Going in the traditional sense to hunt, it took us 4 days. 4 days to find meat. So you still have to sustain yourself for 4 days. And you still have to eat for 4 days. So soups like this were something that could be produced and taken on the hunt, or produced in lieu of meat being there. We sustained our diets predominantly with vegetables and what we could grow, with wild rice, with some of the local berries and medicines and herbs that we gather within the forest. And meat was like sort of supplementary. And depending on where you were, you might be landlocked, so you didn't have fishing. So fish was, depending on which communities. That's why when we see, look at East Coast Indigenous communities and West Coast Indigenous communities, we see a big predominance of seafood and fish. And a lot of people, wow, I really like that cuisine better than yours, because yours is just like soup and like the occasional woodland creature. I'm like, yeah, that's what we had, If we were really lucky, grouse was in abundance, and that would be something we consume. So this soup in itself speaks volumes of it as well, too. When we look to Indigenous communities, especially within the Iroquois Confederacy, specific to that, and that's where I'm from and my knowledge really stems from, it's a matriarchal focus. So honoring the Three Sisters is the same as honoring the clan mothers, the women who would help make decisions for the community. It was always an uneven number of clan mothers, and it was always done on consensus, not majority, meaning that everyone would have to agree or it wasn't there. And the person that disagreed wasn't shunned or mistreated. They were asked why they didn't disagree, or why they disagreed with what was being said, to help provide a little bit more substance and some ideas on why we shouldn't do this or why we should. So there's a lot of backstory behind Indigenous foods when you look at it. Some people will look and say, oh, this is a great soup with squash and vegetables and it's really healthy. Absolutely, 100%. It can be extremely healthy for you. You don't even have to season it. You can leave it without the salt and the pepper, and you're getting all the nutrients and minerals from inside of the different vegetables that are here. My grandmother did it that way. She never put a pinch of salt in it. We used to just sneak salt in when she was looking, into our bowls, and because otherwise she'd be insulted. But for us, it's like one of those things where we stop and we realize that all those connections, all those plants, everything that's growing, all the herbs that are going into it are all interconnected to what grew wild here and what we did. So the recipe itself calls for salt and pepper. You can take that out and the advent of no oil, and you would have it very, very traditional to what it was like during the early days. So to get back to our ingredients, because I know I've gone off a little bit, but I want you to have that information over here because I think that's really important. A lot of people will cook things and never ask why. And that's why I became a chef, is I wanted to know the history behind dishes. So I do have a master's in food sciences. And within that, I've got my major obviously was food sciences instead of chemistry. My minor was in food history and food knowledge that way. So for me, it was a really big deal to know where things came from. So when we're dealing with carrots, a lot of people talk about how it rolls, right? So first of all, it rolls because it's big. So we want to take those ends off. And I'm going to put them to the side, and then we cut it in half. Okay, we cut it in half. A little bit easier to deal with, right? But there's an even easier trick. If you hold and pinch, and you just take a little sliver off the side, now it doesn't rock anymore. It's got that little line there. It stops it from rocking, which means when you go to tuck your finger safely, the carrot is not moving on you. And we've got to cut into little strips, which I'm going to further take down into what we call bâtonnet, which is what we teach our students. And this is the way to get a perfect little dice. And then you eyeball measure approximately how far across you want to go. And that will give you the size that you may want. It's a little inconsistent on my part. You'll have to excuse me. It's kind of a day off today, so I'm not being so harsh on myself. But when I'm going to cut my vegetables, I'm breaking them down the same way an artist breaks down an image before they go to draw and paint. And you may wonder why there's a little steel bowl off to the side. Well, I like to separate my ingredients as I'm cooking. As I said, we are preparing, or we're doing prep to make sure that we can just literally go right to our pot afterwards. We don't want to have to run around and cut the carrots, we throw in the pot, now we're racing to do something else. Now, if you time yourself and set yourself up well, you'll be more than fine to produce the soup within the allotted time. So I'm putting a little bit of speed into that because I want to make sure that we get everything into all of you today and leave room for further questions along the way. It's a quiet lab today, which is really nice because usually I get a very rambunctious group of students when I'm working, but will stop me at every turn. Chef, what about this? Chef, what about that? Chef, chef, chef. Sometimes I know how my mother feels now when she was like, all you kids ever say is mom, 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 mom. Now I feel like chef, 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 So, but that's the joy of it, and that's the fun in it. And I love what I do, and I love doing these kinds of seminars with everyone. As I was mentioning earlier with Samantha, that I've done this before where I was teaching kindergarten students how to make bannock from scratch. And I had 111 kindergarten students all in the same chat in Zoom, all learning how to make bannock all at the same time. I'm surprised I don't have further gray hair than I have right now because it was quite the challenge. So as you can see, I'm just building up my little bowl so I can add that to my soup. Because when I cook and I put a little bit of oil in, I'm going to want my pot to get a little bit of heat, things to start working. Because without heat, there is no cooking. And without cooking, we don't have a dish. There we go. So carrots are prepped. So now I have my carrots prepped, so I'm going to put them off to the side. Next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to go to my zucchini, and the same thing I did with the carrots. I'm going to break it down. Okay, I've left a little end on. I'll take it off because I know some people might be bothering some people. They're looking at like, just take the end off that, please. So I'm going to do this and just break down into 4. And then I'm going to take that 4 and I'm going to divide it by half and divide those halves by half again. And that's how I've gotten a perfect little dice. I literally just go through and I've got the perfect little dice. Why are my zucchini a little bit bigger than the carrots? Because the carrots are a root vegetable and it's going to take them a little longer to cook down and soften while we're making the soup. Whereas squash or zucchini, this one in particular happens to be a little bit more water-based, which is going to take less time to break down when it's in the pot together. So we want everything to try and come together and cook at the same time, which is what our ultimate goal is, so that we don't have crunchy carrots and then overcooked zucchini in the soup. That's really important to me, is making sure that everything matches up all in the same way. And it'll make you appear like you're an expert in the kitchen, when really it's just a little bit of common sense. So I'm going to take that again. I'm going to cut this down by 4. Actually, I'm going to take this one down by 3 because it's a little bit smaller, but I'm still going to break down into 4 even spaces. And I'm not wasting any parts. As you can see, the only thing I took off was the little ends, because I am a firm believer in a traditional philosophy that we work with within the Iroquois Confederacy, specific to the Mohawk culture, called the one bowl, one spoon philosophy. And that philosophy boils down to, in its most primitive form, take what you need to sustain yourself and leave something for the next person. So I know I was teaching a class today. I know that when we're done, everyone in my house is going to be like, what's for dinner? I'd be like, we have soup. It's crummy outside, we have soup. And yes, you can get some crackers and do it up to however you like, or you can take some bagels and dip it in it. I tell you, sometimes my children have the weirdest things that they want to do with food, and that's okay. They're still growing and they're still learning about good food. One thing you will see me do regularly, I wipe my knife in between. It's just a force of habit, because this knife is stainless, but the ones I use in my workplace and at the school are high carbon and have to constantly wipe off any liquid off it, or they start to develop patina a little too fast for my liking. So carrots, squash, now prepared. We're already halfway done. The tough part for us next will be obviously the butternut squash. You could work with it this way. If you feel more comfortable, you could do this and work your way around. The idea is you want 1/4 inch thickness. Okay. This will break down and provide sort of a slurry, which may not sound very appetizing, but that slurry will help thicken the water, chicken stock or vegetable stock, whatever you may be using, and actually provide a little bit of substance to your soup. Make mashed potatoes last night. You want your soup a little bit thicker? Take 2 tablespoons into the amount of the recipe, stir it through, and it'll actually act like a natural thickening agent. You can get away from flour, cornstarch, arrowroot, rice flour, anything like that, just by using something simple as that. I've actually had cooks that have started their soup with a little bit of potato first in the liquid and let it get a little bit thick and simmer, and then they add in their vegetables, and it creates like a creamy texture to it. And you've done that all without the advent of dairy, because in this household, we are dairy intolerant. Everybody. Yeah, I know you're all looking at me and you're like a chef, like a little extra and the padding there. Trust me, the years of butter caught up and I developed lactose intolerance. And that made me so sad, because it ruined pizza, and I thought life was over when pizza was gone. I love pizza, I love cheese, and I love dairy. It just doesn't agree with me. It makes me feel very ill, and I get feverish, and I actually break out hives. So something to consider when you're cooking with food and you're trying to think about thickeners, and maybe you have somebody who's dairy-free and who's gluten-free. Potatoes can add a wonderful starch without causing any digestive problems. So again, same thing, just like I taught you, and just like I told you at the beginning of this, if you're working with it like an art student, breaking it down into even shapes and sections, so that when we cook evenly cut vegetables, the even cut vegetables will all cook in the same manner. The butternut squash is a little less harder than the carrots in terms of it being a root vegetable. A good portion of it starts in the ground, and then it emerges, and then it becomes a part of an above ground growth. So it gets a lot of sunlight, which means that it is a little bit sweeter than carrots are. Carrots are sweet, but butternut squash, I find, when you're cooking with it, is sweeter in flavor. Again, same thing, our little bowl. I'm going to collect all our ingredients. Here I am forgetting my tool. Just a little bench scraper for bakery. And a lot of people see this once in my labs as students, and they're like, wow, I'm going to do that. That's how you can tell you've been in my culinary classes. You see a student with one of these off to the side, and they're scraping up their ingredients. The chef's like, where'd you learn that? Chef Chris taught me. He's always like, oh, you got them buying more equipment, do you? No. Just getting them to use something that's in their toolkit, because they're not studying to be bakers, they're studying to be chefs. If you're baking, that's a great baking tool for scraping and forming, but when washed clean and used elsewhere, can be used for other things. Yeah, it means I got to put down my knife, but again, same thing. We're not in a rush when we cook. We're cooking to showcase our skills. We're cooking to show that we can follow a basic recipe or modify it a little bit. Don't have butternut squash, acorn squash will work. Spaghetti squash will be super stringy and throughout and create almost an indigenous style, what I would call a pho, which I've done before, where I use spaghetti squash into the noodles. I've used venison stock and a mixture of different vegetables from Fall Harvest. That helps us all out, so it's a lot of fun. So my next trick is onions. I'm going to show you how to cut an even onion so that you look like a pro star and you know what you're doing with it. So we've got butternut squash, we've got our carrots, we've got our zucchini. Everything's starting to pile up, and I'm adding them in the order I would put them in. Carrots to start, after the onions, then the butternut squash, then the zucchini, and then because my beans are cooked, if you're using uncooked beans, you would soak them the night before, cook them and reserve them to the side. You can keep a little bit of the cooking liquid if you'd like to add a little bit to your soup, because that will also help thicken, because again, they're starch and they produce a little bit of a fiber. And then our hominy corn will go in just in between the level of carrot and butternut squash, because hominy corn is a little bit woody and needs to break down. If you're using sweet corn, I would put it in the very end. Why? Because sweet corn in itself has already been harvested, blanched, and it's either inside of a bag frozen or inside of a can. If you're using corn on the cob, it doesn't take nearly as long. It's only a minute or two longer. So I've got all my ingredients and I'm starting to line up. We're going to get obviously closer to the stove when the time comes. I'm going to turn my cutting board and use that as my little stand to make sure that we can do these and cook this good together, because I want you to be able to see inside the pot. So the onion. Everybody looks and they say, how do you get the perfectly cut onions? So I take my knife and I lay it flat. Again, I tuck my fingers and I go in and I score into the onion 3/4 of the way in. Again, I'll do the same again one more time. So it's there. Again, 3/4 of the way, not cutting the whole onion, because once you sever this end, that's when the mist and the crying starts happening, and everybody's, oh, don't, you get the cornballs that walk in your kitchen that are like, oh, don't cry for me, and you're like, oh God. I haven't heard that joke 1,000 times in my life. So to avoid all these corny little jokes and remarks about onions, just do that. Okay. Then you're going to take it. You're going to come down. As you can see, I've come down into the onion like that. And I'm going to do that across nice and slow at regular intervals. The only time that my thumb is unprotected is when I'm on the end here, because I'm keeping it from that. But if you don't feel safe doing so, a fork. The fork can help you hold your onion steady. Okay, as well too. If you're afraid of cutting something that's really hard, you can put a fork into it and work. And then your knife runs against the fork tines, and it's keeping your fingers safe. I feel comfortable with the knife and my fingers near the knife, so I'm just going to do it that way. And then now that I've cut that way, as I go through and I cut, I'll turn again. I cut like that, and now I've got perfect little cubes of onion all the way through. Okay. This trick, I will teach my students this 20 minutes of every class that we work together. And when they first start, the onions look atrocious. They're horrible. They're like chunks and everything else. This end piece, okay, everybody says, well, you're wasting end piece. You could chop it up finely and put it in, mince it in. For myself, I'm going to save it for vegetable stock. Because if I wanted to make a vegetable stock, I could use a little bit of the carrot, some celery into a pot, 1 bay leaf, pinch of black peppercorns. 40 minutes later, and you've got fresh vegetable stock. They can be poured in ice cube trays, put it into your freezer, put it into the fridge. And when you want to make the soup, you take out what you need, and there you go. Especially as well too, if you know that it's 300 milliliters and you have the little deli containers, like something like this, you could fill it up with the liquid, and then when you're making your soup, you just drop it right in, let it cook with it. So you can do things with the end piece. Mine's going to compost, simply because we're in a cooking demonstration today. I'm not going to waste it, but it will go to my compost. So very simple and easy for the onions. I'm going to move these guys just a little bit along, a little further. And so that comes with 27 years of experience. As I tell you, first, accuracy first, then speed, okay? And see, no tears. It's like Johnson & Johnson no tears shampoo. These are no tear onions. So now you've learned a little trick. you can choose to share with everybody, or adversely, you can do like I do with the piece of bread and ask everybody to eat the piece of bread while cutting onions, and it's really fun and entertaining. Don't fall prey to any of the gimmicks that are out there. None of them work. None of the onion goggles, this, that, the other thing. No. If you cut onions properly and you don't store them in the refrigerator, people put onions in the refrigerator all the time. That helps the sugar come to the surface, and that makes misting automatic. So when you go somewhere and you see onions in the fridge, you know your eyes are going to burn. So they're already ready to go. I'm going to give a quick little wipe to my cutting board because I have cut onions. I've just got a quick little damp towel. Onions on a wooden board, and I'm using wood for vegetables. I should stress that enough. If you're working with meat does not go onto a wooden board. It goes onto a cheap plastic board, or as we have in our industry, we have these wonderful boards as well too. These are straight out of Japan. This is rubber board. So there's a wood centerpiece in the inside. They're called a Hasigawa cutting board. And what happens when the knife is impacting on this, it's not damaging the edge of the knife. It keeps the knife super sharp for a lot longer. Wood will blunt a knife a little more frequently, so it needs more sharpening, and plastic is the biggest offender in terms of taking down a knife really quickly. So
I really like your idea with the scraper too, because I've used the knife so much to grab stuff after I'm done cutting. And when you do that constantly, it just dulls your knife out so much.
People do this all the time, like where they drag the edge. If you want to use your knife, turn it to the back. Use the spine of the blade as well too. I mean, you got to be careful with the sharp edge, or adversely, as I show some folks, I always have a large Cck Cleaver inside of my kitchen for really big boards and squash. This in itself is designed for that scooping methodology. That's where everybody sees it come from. People think that French chefs were constantly scooping up with the blade. No, it was first seen in terms of Chinese kitchens and how they work with it. This is a carbon steel cleaver. I didn't think it was really appropriate to bring out a cleaver to teach you guys how to cook with. I mean, granted, if we were doing food of this period and of that kind of culture, then yes, I would have the appropriate tool for it. But for myself, in this instance, I just chosen to use a very simple little stainless steel Japanese blade. But yes, the back of the knife, the spine, will prevent you from dulling down. Honestly, I'm not one to plug places, but I got a 3-pack of these on Amazon for $4. Okay. They showed up literally the next day if you've got a Prime account, and there's a green, a white, and a black. And I put the black one in at work because the black one looks really cool, and the green one I have at home because it's kind of like green and I know it won't get lost in and amongst. As you can see, there's a plethora of tools here. Behind me, there's a collection of like everything from a Vitamix to a dehydrator to a rice cooker. So I didn't want it to get lost. And then the white one I keep for bakery. So I just kind of separated them out. I'm like, this one general purpose, black one at work because it looks cool, white one for bakery, and there you go. So, and they last a long time. Like this is going on like 4 years roughly. I think they may have raised the price a little bit, but can't be that much. So I've got my board cleaned. I got a little butcher's twine with me. Okay. Butcher's twine is not listed in the recipe, but it's what I'm going to use to bundle together my rosemary. I don't need a lot. So I'm going to take a little piece. I'm going to take my little rosemary. If you're using thyme, you could do that as well too. I'm going to tie the end. Doesn't have to be anything fancy, doesn't have to be anything cute. What we're trying to do is keep it from floating all around the pot and bouncing around and breaking up. If you tie your herb to the handle and it's inside of the liquid, it won't bounce. It will only move side to side. It won't go up and down and fly all over the place, which won't cause all the rosemary stems to come off. What I'm trying to do is infuse the broth, because this is my broth today. #1 quality, City of Ottawa H2O. There's nothing fantastic or special about this broth, and the reason why I've chosen water is that what I was taught with when I first made this recipe. I have a liter here of water. Does the recipe say a liter? No. And people always panic and say, oh, no, it only says 200 milliliters. What's this guy doing? I'm doing 5 times the recipe. So the recipe that I sent along to Samantha, that I know she's going to share with all of you, is designed to feed one person. I wholeheartedly believe in these big giant size recipes and meals being shoved out to people who need to be drawn back, and we need to look at, what do I realistically need to eat? Do I need that much? No? Okay. All right, let's change it. So I've got my water, I've got all my vegetables set up, I've got my pot right here, my rosemary is tied, and I'm going to prepare my sage for the end of it. I got a couple little pieces of rosemary we're going to get rid of. When we work with herbs, the #1 thing I see people do is they pick it up and they put it on the board. And no. When you press down on herbs like that vigorously, you're crushing them, crushing and pulling out all the oils. What you want to do, remove the individual leaf from the stem. The stems could be saved. I keep mine inside of a little bag in the freezer, and I will throw them into stocks when I'm working. And be selective too. If something looks bruised and you don't want to eat it, then don't pull it off to serve it. So that should be enough sage for me. I had extra. I was so graciously given the extra, so I'm just going to pull it off to the side for myself for now. And I line up my herbs in a nice, neat little line. And then I just slowly, as you can see, I'm drawing a circle with the heel of the knife. And that's how you properly cut. And as you go along and you do that, you see cooks all the time where they're like, with the parsley, and then you look at the board and it's green. When the recipe or when the board is green, all the flavor that you've just pressed out of the herb has now gone in the cutting board. You would get more flavor if you ate the cutting board than you would from that herb. So we want to be gentle with the herb and make sure that it's nice and neatly set off to the side. And see, not a lot. A little bit goes a long way, and that expression is so true when we're working with fresh herbs. Don't feel you need to put the entire bunch of thyme in or the entire bunch of rosemary. If you're going to make the soup and you get something like that, like rosemary or thyme off to the side, then what I would suggest doing is like picking another dish where you know you're going to need rosemary and using it and saying, okay, I'm going to use rosemary here. So we're about to get into the pot. Let's get in and get cooking. So I'm going to bring you all a little bit closer. Again, there's no fancy cameras inside of my kitchen. We're doing this completely from my laptop with a nice long extension cable on my headset so that you can all hear me, because this is how it ends up working in my home. So there we go. Now we're over top of the stove. I've rested you all neatly on my cutting board, and if there's any problems with that, just let me know. But I want you to be able to see into the pot while I'm working. Okay. And I actually, I'm going to work with this one. I don't have my smaller one with me here. So oil, okay, a little bit of oil. I'm going to preheat my stove. I've got it on high because I want movement first. When you're cooking, you're not just cooking by smell and by sight, you're cooking by sound. And remember, it's too hot, take it off. Now you'll have to bear with me a couple minutes because we have one of those stoves that's got the nice little elements that need to depress in. And of course, my lovely pots, when we bought this, we didn't think about that. So it doesn't like to take those into consideration. So sometimes it may take a minute or two to heat up. But again, when we're cooking, we're not rushing. We're taking our time. We're making sure that we're enjoying what we're doing. We're having fun with it. And this is a great recipe in itself. Like if you had 3 people in a kitchen working together and you have the space, everybody's doing something, everybody's involved in some way. Maybe somebody's making veg stock to go into the soup, somebody's peeling up the vegetables and getting ready, someone's cutting them, someone's cooking some beans. All these things can happen together as a group. It's also a very simple exercise when working with children to introduce them to vegetables. The number one thing to do, especially, I don't know if anybody in this room has little ones, if you want children to get involved in food and like to eat what you've made for them, get them to help cooking. It is a proven psychological fact that when you are cooking food, as you're involved in the cooking process, you become more apt to want to eat what is produced. You're not afraid. We're going to break out my favorite wooden spoon. This one has followed me. It has worn down. It was at one time something similar to this. It has worn down over the years. Everybody's got that one wooden spoon in the kitchen that they love. You can't see it anymore, but on the handle, this is actually one of the original spoons from my kit when I was in the Cordon Bleu Paris. And I was in my early 20s. And so this thing is well over 20 years old. You can see it's got a little bit of burning on it. But you know what? I still can't let it go. Everybody's got that one favorite tool in the kitchen they have. This is it for me. Everybody says a simple wooden spoon with all those thousands of dollars in knives. Don't really care about those. So just a little drizzle. If I had to measure the little drizzle, I would tell you it is no more than a teaspoon and a half. And the first thing I'm going to do, incorporate my onions. And I'm going to take off my headset, and you're going to hear, and I don't know if it comes in completely clear or not, but you should hear a good sizzle. That is the sound and the start to cooking when you're doing things. I am not going to agitate too much. I'm going to move a little bit around. If you want the maximum flavor to come out of your onions, pinch of salt. Pinch of salt helps bring the natural sugars of the onions to the surface and helps them to start caramelizing. Moving around, you should hear sounds, and I'm going to turn down from high heat to medium high. I want the onions to cook but not burn. The idea is that we want to have nice caramelization inside the pot, but no burning. So as we take a quick peek, you can see on the inside, there's absolutely no burning going on inside of my pot right now. But I'm going to incorporate my carrots. because as you add things to the pot, what's going to happen is it's going to cool down the pot a little bit and makes it a little more bearable to work with. Same thing. What I'm doing right now by stirring and mechanically moving the onions and carrots through in the pot, what I'm doing is I'm sweating the vegetables. And sweating is an application. So I'm making the actual water and sugar content come to the surface, and that's how your vegetables get a nice little glistening shine. Again, same thing. When we're looking inside the pot, you can see there's a nice little glistening shine inside of the pot, and that's an indication that our vegetables are starting to sweat. That sweating occurs and helps us get the vegetables tender and soft for consumption. So when we're going to eat it, we don't have raw carrots. I know the liquid's going to cook them a little bit, but we want to start that process along the way. Because if you go cold for everything, it's going to take you 3 hours to make the soup. You want to make sure you got a little bit going on. Tap off the excess. I see that liquid coming to the surface. So now my squash is gone. Butternut squash is in, as you can see. Making dishes off to the side. I'm going to be regretting that later, because when you're inside of an alcoholic kitchen, there's always a little assistant off to the side who wants to help out and help produce. So they help you with dishes. I don't think anyone's going to want to help me do dishes later. So I'll send everybody some tips on quick dishwashing tips. So we've got butternut squash in, and as you won't necessarily hear it from my mic, and you wouldn't even hear it if I brought the mic close to the pot is starting to slow down. It's starting to reduce down its heat to match off with the temperature I put it. That's extremely important, especially when you're doing something on electric burners. A lot of people say, how do you adapt electricity to gas and vice versa? You need, remember, when you're cooking, it's like driving a standard motorized vehicle. You got to shift down, you got to shift up at times when you want something a little faster. And then when you're right where you want to be, you get that gear set and you keep yourself consistently moving at that pace. Okay? Because once you're there, all will be good. So I'm going to get my squash in. Now I'm going to add my liquid to the pot. And if you are doing this without a recipe, and you want to know how much, I do enough to cover the vegetables and about a thumb more. Okay, so when people are cooking, when some people are in some spaces where they're cooking rice and they say they use a thumb to cook the rice, they're really touching the top of the rice and putting your thumb on. That's how much water above the rice is going in. It's the same given with what we call a clear soup. This is a clear soup because there's no cream, it's vegetables and a broth that are brought together. And it is the most common thing throughout. So, and how I kept the spoon so long on the side. That is a cardinal rule in my kitchen at home and at work. We always put our spoon on the side because we're not boiling the spoon for flavor. We're bringing the water to a boil to reduce to a simmer to add our vegetables to. Bring back our rosemary, the little butcher's twine. I take it. If you're doing this on a gas stove, make sure you trim the extra away. You don't want it to burn and catch fire. So I'm going to pull it over. Do that. And you'll start to see elements of the steam coming to the surface within the pot. If you want a closer look in the inside, there we go. As you can see, everything's there. There's not a ton of water. Why haven't I added salt and pepper though? Why haven't I put salt and pepper directly into this pot? Well, let me tell you why. Because we season things in the end. We want all the flavors to develop and to come out naturally. We want the onions to slowly simmer inside the liquid along with the carrots and the butternut squash. We want them to give that flavor to the soup. But what we want to do is wait till the end to finish them. Hence why I have my sage here. I can move it right out of the picture because what I want to do with that sage is I'm going to put that in the end and in the end. I don't want that to become lost and gray in color. Sage is already like kind of like an olive green to it. And if you throw it into a liquid, it just turns black and it's unappealing. It's the same way if you crush it when you're chopping it as well too. It will just become black and unappealing. So I just move a little bit and agitate because I just want to see what's going on. When I move with my spoon, I'm looking at the bottom to see if small bubbles are starting to form on the bottom of the pot, and then they get slowly, gradually larger. As they get larger, it starts to come to a boil. When it comes to a boil, I'm going to reduce it to a simmer, and I'm going to add my zucchini in at that time, and I'm going to add my beans in it, and I'm going to allow it to simmer for roughly 10 minutes. The reason why I'm doing 10 minutes is because I know the vegetable size that I've cut is appropriate for a 10-minute simmer inside of liquid. But if your vegetables are a little bigger, you may have to reduce the amount of time in which you are simmering your vegetables, or increase, excuse me, the amount of time you're simmering your vegetables. So if you have larger chunks of carrot and larger chunks of squash, because that's what you want, and that's what you want to eat, then that's okay as well too. It just might take you longer. The cardinal rule in the industry, and especially when cooking for someone else, is that your ingredients should fit onto a spoon. So if your pieces are bigger than that, the spoon comfortably fits inside of your mouth, right? So if it's bigger than the spoon, it's going to be an uncomfortable bite. So I'm thinking about you when I'm cooking, even on its most basic form of what can you comfortably eat and put into your mouth without it being overpowering. And this takes me to another point too. When I'm cooking, especially with everyone that's visiting, spoons, 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 spoons everywhere. You will see us in the kitchen go through 100 spoons in an afternoon, no problem whatsoever. And the reason for all those spoons is tasting. Because as you're cooking, you want to put in and you want to do it single use, especially if you're serving guests. Right now, it tastes like water and carrots. It will taste a little more than water and carrots in the end when we're done. The reality is that having that many spoons with you handy is something that you definitely want to make sure that you have on hand. So it's going to come up to, I can see it starting to form in the bottom. It's going to start to come up to a simmer. And when it comes up to a simmer, it'll go to a boil. And this is also why I'm using a wider based pot rather than the tighter pot that's taller, because the more surface, it's got less surface area to try and heat up all at once. If everything's tall, it's going to take forever for those bubbles to reach the top and then come back down to create that interaction and that motion of heat. Whereas with it's smaller and it's this amount, it's going to take less time for it to come to the surface. And that's kind of one of the tricks when we're cooking, especially online with all of you. We use larger pots, wider, to be able to present things and make sure you can see them. So I'm hoping everybody's following along so far and taking some information from this, because it's one of these things that has long been lost. One of the big important things to remember is that as we look back, just passing by September 30th and Orange Shirt Day and our discussions about the TRC, especially with the 94 calls to action, Section 34 of the TRC directly relates to us as Algonquin alumni, teachers, and community, is that we have a responsibility to the call to action for education. And the reason why I chose this dish is that this dish is synonymous with every nation, all Indigenous nations. There are 650 communities in Canada. And out of those 650, there are 73 individual different nations that exist. And those nations are all represented in those different communities. And those different communities all produce different food, different ways of making bannock. And just to note, bannock is not traditionally an Indigenous dish. And that is an entirely separate lecture piece on its own, one that I host quite frequently and will be hosting in November as a discussion of Indigenous food and food sovereignty and Indigenous food history. But one dish that exists synonymous with all nations is Three Sisters soup. The story of Three Sisters may vary from nation to nation within those 650 communities and within those 73 individual and distinct Indigenous First Nations. And when I say Indigenous First Nations, I'm referring to Indigenous persons. I'm not referring specific to Métis and Innu, which make up their entirely different set of communities and nations represented. So this dish exists within every community, but there's variations across the board of what's going on. And as you guys are watching what's going on here, just to touch base back onto our soup, you can see a little bit of steam rising from it. I can hear the pot is starting to creak as I'm listening to it. This pot in itself tells me as it's getting ready to boil, it starts to creak a little bit just because it's an older pot. And it's well loved and well used, but it's got its little ticks to it that tell me I am almost ready to come to a boil. And they always say a wash pot never boils, and that's what happens when we're doing these cooking things. Sometimes I used to do the old, and by the magic of television, here it is, it's all done. I don't like doing that anymore. I feel it kind of cheats the process. You know, you want to see the real thing happening in front of you, and I feel it's really important. So if it takes us 4 minutes for a pot of soup to boil and come to a boil and reduce to simmer, then so be it. But with this dish, the culinary importance and the representation and presenting this dish to you today as well too is sharing that in that action, in that call to action number 34, and representation of the education, because I feel that I have learned this from my own community and I've shared it with my students in the programming, but I also feel that the only way that we break down the barriers between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities is by sharing the knowledge with the non-Indigenous persons that live in this country, newcomers to Canada that have just arrived here and are learning about all the diversity and inclusivity that we have within our country. They need to understand and see the original descendants here, and we need to share that. Because a lot of people are like, well, no, they won't understand our culture. They won't understand the culture unless you share it. So that's why this recipe was really important with me to share with all of you. Our dining room manager, Kathy Dwar, who's been an absolute I've been a supporter of the Indigenous Pre-Apprenticeship Program since I entered into it in the last 3 years. I've been the coordinator for the last 2. Has done nothing but support me and stand behind me on those days where sometimes things didn't feel like they were working out so well. And she said, you're the voice of the Indigenous community within the School of Hospitality, and we need you to yell about the food and get people interested. We were packed every day during the summer in the restaurant, and this soup would sell out every day. And people will ask, why Three Sisters soup? What's the importance of it? And I would say, because this represents every single nation's contribution to Indigenous culinary, because it exists in all of them. The name is different. The Cree word for it would be different than the Ojibwe word, than the Algonquin, and then the Anishinaabe, the Tyendinaga, the Cayuga, the Oneida, the Huron, and myself, the Mohawk, which we are known as the Onwe, or the Gahaga people, the people of the Flint. We represent this dish in all of our communities and our community dealings, and it's represented as Three Sisters. So it showcases our connection to the matriarchy within our communities, but also the collection of harvests and ingredients. I can only imagine what this must have looked like. Historically, I try to envision what this was like over top of open coals and cooked outside. Like, this must have been amazing. It must have been amazing to see. And so, hoping this year we can encourage that within our next fall community as well too, as we do the harvest from the Three Sisters Garden. Maybe, just maybe, we can convince our culinary students to get outside, produce a big fall soup on like another day, and we could do something such as this with all of you in person, because I miss the in-person interaction. It's nice to have had a lab and have people gathered around to learn about Indigenous foods. Unfortunately, we're still being cautious and we're being careful, as we rightfully should. But I want to make sure you know that in the future, as the opportunities get there, we can start to do that. So I'm starting to see movement in the pot. It's getting ready to come to a boil. I'm being impatient a little bit with it. It's like, come on, you should be boiling. And today it's like, I'm not going to boil because you're on camera and you're in front of everybody else. I'm going to embarrass you. So I can see it starting to boil. So I'm going to add in all my zucchini. Yes, all of that zucchini, because I want it to get nice and tender. And then all that leaves us left is the corn and the beans. And I'm going to add the corn at the same time because I want it to break down a little bit as well too. And the soup is not meant to be super watery. It should be, if I had to compare it to something, I would say it's as close to a minestrone as humanly possible, without the noodles and without the tomato base. But in itself, hominy corn will break down a bit, the vegetables will break down, and now I can see it's starting to light simmer inside my pot. So that light simmer inside the pot is what's going to give us all that wonderful flavor, but the beans are going to go in the end, as is the sage. So the sage was just an addition to the recipe. Is it something you have to do? No. Could you add parsley to it? Sure. When you're finished, if you wanted to, this would be really nice with some garlic roasted croutons. The reason why there is no garlic in the soup is that we traditionally didn't have garlic as a sustainable plant. We had garlic scapes, and we had leeks, and we had like wild growth of leeks, but wild garlic was something that was introduced here and not necessarily something that was as predominant, and it wasn't cooked with, actually. Scapes were used as a tea to help with indigestion. I know it sounds very, very strange, but scapes themselves have this very calming, soothing effect on somebody. It was a great way to stop heartburn, which was very uncommon at the time in terms of normal digestive things that we'd be facing. But it was also something that would, you'd stop and say, well, this is a great way to stop it. But I'm being careful with my pot as well too, because I have the rosemary in there and I don't want to break the rosemary apart and have a big chunk. So a few of them here and there are nice, but we've all had that dry rosemary seasoning, okay, where you get little pieces in your teeth and it kind of feels like an unpleasant texture on the gum. Well, that's what I'm trying to avoid with this. So if you're using rosemary like I've done, just make sure you aren't mashing it in there, because it's going to all separate apart. And you'll be standing there with a little pair of tweezers picking out each little individual piece. So you don't want to have to do that. What I want you to do is be able to enjoy it. So I've got light simmer in the bottom of my pot. I'm going to incorporate in a small amount of the beans, not all of them, because I've got a lot of hominy corn in there, and that's a good amount of fiber. These, for all intents and purposes today, were a canned bean. I did not have the time to getting fresh beans into my kitchen, which I normally have inside of my pantry as a pantry staple. But unfortunately, I didn't have that. So I decided to go with the canned option. I've rinsed them very, very well under warm water, not cold. That will get away that briny feel that exists inside of the can. And I've got just a little extra liquid because I just want to add just a touch more, because I see I have room just to add a little bit more. But as you can see, the consistency of the soup, I bring this off, is very thick inside the pot. Okay, that squash has started to break down and is actually changing the color of the broth to a light yellow. But I want it to continue to go, and it's going to take its time. And of course, today's the day where it takes its sweet time on the stove. But when it starts to simmer a little bit more, the vegetables are going to become even more tender as we go through. And I can see it. I've got little tiny bubbles moving through. I've got a nice little amount of steam that's coming up. Why don't I cover it? Because when I cover it, I find it becomes an uncontrolled boil, and you get that quick flash in the pan, like where everything kind of like boils up. That quick flash is actually your nutritional value exiting the pot. So when you boil things, when it comes to a full tilt boil and it starts to bubble like that, it's actually breaking down stuff and creating this like uneven foam that comes to the surface. And what I always advise people to do is just avoid that. Be patient and wait for it just to naturally simmer on its own. So I've used the beans that I want to for this. So I'm going to obviously put the other beans off to the side. Use those later in a little bit of a salad. And I'm notorious as I go through, I always keep a towel handy just so I can wipe down my stove as I'm working. I like to work clean, and I like to make sure that things are organized and clean inside of my kitchen as I go. So I put things away as I'm finishing off. So once this comes up to a boil, again, it comes to a second boil, I'm going to turn it down to a simmer and just let it simmer for roughly about 10 minutes. When it simmers for 10 minutes, after that, I'm going to taste it for seasoning, and we're going to see exactly how well the soup tastes, and is it done? Is it ready? Is it prepared to my liking? So for myself, I like a little bit extra salt inside of my soups, because as a chef, I've always enjoyed salt inside of my food. So I like to make sure that I have a good flavor in my dish. Some of you may be salt sensitive. Some of you may be cooking for someone that's on a sodium reduced diet. So you may want to be considerate on what you're putting in there. It's all your personal preference. And that's why in the recipe, you'll see two letters beside it. TT means to taste. And I always tell people that's the way that we work when we're in the kitchen, is to taste. So if we're tasting the soup in itself, we'll decide how much salt and pepper that we put in. So I've noticed as we're going through, I've noticed a few things just pop in the chat. I always like to take a quick peek and see what people are saying in there. I always love to just touch base with that, because it's always great to see what people are posting. I know they may not all be questions, but soup looks good. Well, thank you. It's fantastic. I love that. To cook after trauma, my brain forgot how to do this. You have some passion for it, and the soup looks good. Well, thank you. I always try and bring that passion to the classroom, especially when I'm cooking with people virtually. It's a little bit harder. When you're all working with me in a lab, you'll arrive. There's usually a knife on your table and there's a bunch of vegetables, and I'm like, all right, let's get cooking. But unfortunately, we're not doing that today. So I got to show that passion along the way. As I started, as mentioned, I've done Michelin-starred restaurants, and some of those restaurants are a little bit more stressful than an online cooking seminar. You're expected to perform, and you're expected to be producing food at a high level and really, really competitive with your fellow cooks. And when we're doing something such as this, it's nice because we're all together and we're sharing. And that's, again, goes right back to the philosophy of the one bowl, one spoon philosophy, where we're sharing the harvest together. We're sharing the food together and taking what we need. So if I made this big pot of soup, and we're all sitting together, I would take what I felt comfortable eating in the moment, make sure that there was enough left for everybody else. And that's the way that most Indigenous food ideology in Canada has worked and has been presented, and that we present at the college as well too when we're working with our students, is to present that ideology forward and get them to understand that that's how it works, and that's what we should be doing. And with that, they get very, very like focused on that, and they start to think about that. And I challenge them to think about it in their own way of life and how they eat, and what they're doing at home and how they eat at home, because that to me is an extremely important lesson to pass along, especially when we're talking about what can the college do in regards and its answers to the calls to action within the TRC, and what is our TRC board presenting as well too. There's a lot of talk about education and sharing in that knowledge, and I wanted to keep that going. And I think this is a perfect suit for that time of the year as well. So now I've got a good simmer going on. I can see that everything is actually starting to come together nice and tender. I press on my vegetables to see how they're doing. When they start to feel a little bit softer, that tells me we're getting close. Like the squash is already, as you can see, already can be broken down with a spoon. Just by pressing on it. I press on it, it's already breaking. So as you can see, it didn't need much extreme heat to it. It's a very, very, it's an exercise in gentle heat. gentle hands when we're handling the vegetables, and gentle in our productions and preparations. And so as this simmers and breaks down, it's taking out the flavor obviously out of the rosemary that's tied off to the side that's there, or thyme if you're using it. It's going to take that and infuse it inside the broth, as well as all the flavors of all the vegetables that we have in there. The hominy corn, the carrots, the squash, the onions that we lightly cooked and sweated to bring out all the natural sugars. And we're going to turn magically water that's been poured into a pot with a bunch of vegetables into a delicious and flavorful dish. And we'll finish with fresh sage. So it's a quiet group. I had a couple of questions so far, but are there any questions so far as we're going along and waiting for this to continue to simmer? I know I'm doing a lot of talking, but I'm always ears to other people contributing to the conversation. So please jump in. Don't be afraid. If you got a question, just raise your hand, or if you want to make a statement, please go ahead. I'm all ears. The floor is yours for a few minutes. I'll stop talking.
Oh, I think we have a question from Brian. Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, and somebody's coming to my door there. So you mentioned, I know, like seasoning with salts, like, you know, after, so you kind of like understand the flavors and you can kind of build the seasoning up to where you want to. What do you think about adding some salt at the bottom of the pot when you're like searing like vegetables and stuff for like that Maillard reaction or those sort of things?
I don't see anything wrong with that either way. In this instance, for all intents and purposes and what we're doing, I'm seasoning in the end because that liquid is going to start to concentrate and reduce. So that salt, the actual molecule itself, will have less space to travel and becomes much more dense. It becomes concentrated. I think it has a lot to do. I think seasoning has a lot to do with like how much reduction is going to occur. I know that this is a smaller pot and I also set it up so it's foolproof for a person. So if it's their first time really seasoning something, remember, we can always put more salt in. We can't detract it. The only way to really take it away is the advent of honey. I always remind people that it's very, very, like half teaspoon of honey can actually cut the sharpness of salt inside of something, including soup. May add a little sweetness to your soup that you don't want. Yeah, those are some great tricks. So when you see a chef and he tastes the sauce and he makes kind of a face, he may have over seasoned it, or it could be bitter. You'll add a tablespoon of honey and you'll never know. Trust me. Many people have dined in some of the best restaurants I've worked in, and they're like, sauce is amazing. And meanwhile, I'm thinking to myself, man, that sauce was messed up. I had a bad day today. I don't know how to get around it. I got around it with a little bit of honey. But to go back to your point,
interesting. I've never heard that before. So yeah, thanks for that tip. It's cool.
No problems. No problems. That's why I love doing these, because all those years of knowledge, and I mean, it's not openly stated within Algonquin, but I'm departing the line as of this week, and I'll be starting in my new role as an Indigenous culinary educator with the Ottawa Carleton District School Board. I'm not leaving Algonquin College, as many people have been fearful of. It's just another role that takes me away from the everyday hustle and bustle of the kitchen. I've done my time in the kitchen and I've been on the line and I've worked really hard on that, but it's also time to share all that 27 years of knowledge with people. One of the big things I've always found really saddening is when the chef's like, no, that's my secret. Well, you learn that secret so you could share it with other people. So, you know, I don't believe in family secrets. I'm not going to tell you. Ask me anything about food, and I will make sure that you understand what we've got. So, yes, definitely a good question. You could, depending on what your application is and what you're doing with the salt, you could season your vegetables ahead of time and put them into the pan. If you're going to, I'm going to say, if you're going to reduce it inside of the liquid, make sure that you're conscious of what salt you put in and how much liquid you're working with. Otherwise, you could wind up with like a salty dish you need to make adjustments to. And that's never really fun. If you have to add a little more in the end, that's always a good thing. So I hope that helps a little bit. Does anybody else have any other questions, concerns, comments, queries, things not related to the recipe, food questions? I'm always here to take them.
I've got just a general question, Chris, if you don't mind.
Sure, absolutely.
You mentioned you got a couple of kids. I don't know exactly how many, but so do you cook like fancy food for them often, or like, are you the main chef in your household? Like, how does that work?
I do a lot of the cooking in the household.
Okay.
My schedule as of late has not contributed to that so much. My National Arts Center schedule has been a little bit hectic as we ran the Chef's Table series that would see 400 people dining all at once on a 5-course meal. So there's a lot of production. Yeah, and doing that over a 3 to 4 day span could be difficult. But I do everything. I'll do traditional dishes such as this. To who hasn't gone into the freezer, broken out some simple chicken fingers and some McCain's French fries out of a bag and just enjoyed that to actually making my own ramen broth from scratch and noodles and producing that right from the ground up with the stained egg and everything else, and like a pork, a pork loin that could be carved in so we could have tonkatsu ramen.
That
So
sounds
that's
so good.
yeah, it's so much fun.
Oh,
And that's just it.
awesome.
That's why talking not just about the food today, but like in general, presenting little things on the board is to try and interest you in cooking for yourself, because that's one of the most important things. And that's what I'm taking in the high school level with my students, is to make sure that we don't forget that food is fun. And I
Yeah.
think that gets forgotten a lot in my industry, is that food can be fun and can be delicious, but you got to make fun out of it. You got to have fun while you're working with it. So
Yeah.
just getting it to do that.
So besides Indigenous cooking, do you have a certain style of food that you like to cook often, or that you're especially good at?
A lot of people ask that, and I have a huge focus on Japanese food in itself and Japanese cuisine. I spent 3 years cooking in and out of kitchens throughout Japan. And so that taught me a lot of my food philosophy and how I handle things. It was influenced. So a lot of my Indigenous hybrid foods that I work on right now are actually Japanese influence as well too. So people see it and they're like, whoa, there's a lot of similarities between the culture and the respect for food, the respect for the equipment, the knives, respect for the ingredients. So I was really drawn to that. It's really brought that to the surface for myself. And so I find myself doing a lot of that. But if I'm doing something on my own, like just no Indigenous, Japanese, I'll be making dumplings from scratch, and working on, udon dishes and just creating my own sauces right from the ground up. I don't buy anything packaged. There's none of this. I'm VH, honey garlic sauce going in. No, if we're doing it, we're doing original katsu sauces, and we're working on our own eel sauces. And that in itself is just a wonderful adventure into ingredients. And it gets you into a market, and it breaks down that door as well too. Because one thing that a lot of people forget to do is shop outside the grocery store. Go to the market. You go to your Asian grocer and go see what's there. There's things that have funny packaging and lettering on it. Buy it and find out what it is. You'll discover some wonderful things. I helped out a friend of mine who was running Gong Fu Bao here in Ottawa, down on Bank Street. It's a popular little place with sorts of steam buns and a lot of traditional Cantonese style street food dishes. I discovered this wonderful paste called toban. It's spicy and sweet at the same time, but needs to be cooked in a little bit of oil. And then you throw your onions in and gets this red color to it. And it makes everything beautiful red and like a barbecue red. And people say to me, they're like, whoa, where did this flavor come from? Like, just completely by playing with something I had never played with before. I would have never picked up because the packaging looked intimidating to me, and I learned something new. So that's my big challenge to people, is go into a place like, Ottawa, we have Green Market, we've got Chinatown that's abundant with things. We got a few other little stores that have popped up that are starting to carry specialty Asian ingredients from everywhere, from Thailand to South Korea to Japan to China. Go and find something. And if you're not sure, ask somebody, point you in the direction of something unique that you've never tried. You can say, I want to try a different noodle today. What would you suggest? Ask the person in the shop. They'll point you in that direction and you'll learn something completely new. You may discover an instant ramen package that blows your mind, that puts Mr. Noodle to shame, and you'd love it. And so I tell people all the time, don't be afraid to get out there and experience new and crazy things with food, because all that experimentation and learning is fun, not just to discover, but it's also fun for your taste buds too. Nothing wrong with trying something a little different and seeing how something else goes. So are there any other questions? Anybody else got any comments, concerns, queries? You've got a chef with 27 years of experience here to offer you any advice you might need while we just wait for this to finish for a couple more minutes.
Not much of a question.
Oh, sorry, Paul. Go
Oh, good. Less of a question. I more just wanted to say that I appreciate your focus on the enjoyment and your pace of cooking here, because I found myself burnt out on cooking. When I was younger, I thought like I wanted to get into cooking as a profession, and I realized that I did not like the pace of working in a kitchen. But recently I have found the joys of cooking for myself and how cooking it can still be fun, and cooking can be a big part of your life without it being your profession. And I appreciate your focus on the cooking on a more for yourself perspective.
Absolutely. No, and that's the big thing as well too, is like good food will give you good energy, and it will give you good vibes throughout the day, and it helps you along the way. Don't get me wrong. There's nothing wrong with a bag of M&Ms and a thing of chips and maybe an episode of Squid Game on Netflix on a rainy afternoon. We are all guilty of doing that. I'm guilty of that more often than not, because I'm a professional chef and I get home and everybody's usually asleep and the kitchen's closed. So it's usually some crazy instant ramen noodles that I found somewhere, but I'm still taking the time to make that bowl of instant noodles the way that I want it. And the focus is on making myself something that's going to feel satisfying. I think the term soul food has been misused in labeling African and Afrocentric diaspora that exists in the United States. And I feel that soul food should be more of a focus on what comforts you in the inside, what makes you feel good. And when I cook at this pace for when I'm doing demonstrations or working with people, it's to inspire you to want to cook again. You know, there's nothing better than going out, finding a recipe online, finding that cookbook that's got a couple recipes you want to try, and just doing it at your own pace. It's the best part. I love that. I buy a new cookbook literally every month just for that reason, so I can find maybe 1 or 2 recipes, and then I read through it and discover a whole bunch of new techniques, which just add to my repertoire. But that's the best part about it. So I'm going to pull back to the soup for 2 seconds here because we have reached the stage that I want to. So then how can I tell? I might ask. One of my big things is I can smell it, but also the hominy corn has turned out just like popcorn. It has nearly doubled in size for every little piece of corn that I put in there. It's absolutely delicious. So I'm going to take it off heat. Obviously, I'm finished with my cutting board, and I am finished now with my secure little tab. The great thing about these, I buy them in a roll from the dollar store. They're $2 for a roll. I cut them, and as they wear out completely, they're washable and they can dry. But as it wears out completely, it's really easy just to toss away. And they're meant for lining the insides of drawers. So I just do that, and I put it off to the side for now. Put away my cutting board. Obviously, I do not wish to burn my counters, no matter how old and gray they may look. So I'm going to bring my pot of soup over. I'm going to pick you guys up and take you for a quick lift inside the pot. As we can see, look at all the wonderful colors of the fall in there. But we have a couple more things to do before we finish off this dish. I'm going to take just a little tiny knife. Go ahead and cut the string. You're going to pull up my rosemary, and as you can see, a little bit of it has fallen off the branch, but most of it's still there, and it has changed color. It's lost that vibrant green chlorophyll sort of color that exists inside of it. That's what makes vegetables green, is chlorophyll. I love butcher's twine as well too, because butcher's twine is pretty natural. I'll actually break down inside of the compost, so that can all go directly to compost. I'm going to give it a quick look. All my sage right into the pot, because I want that flavor to go through. I'm going to stir it in. And at this point, the soup is nice and hearty and thick. You can see I'm going to grab it with the liquid. As you can see, it is very, very thick and hearty. All the pieces there. And the whole idea is that a spoonful gives me what I need, right? What I'm looking for. But I know the vegetables are going to taste great. One of the big things for finishing this for myself will be tasting the broth. And that's why I always tell my young cooks, if I can teach you how to cook anything in the world, I can't teach you attitude. The other thing I can't teach you how to do is your palate. So you need to taste. So I'm gonna realize I can taste all the corn in there. I can taste all the vegetables. I'm gonna put a little pinch of black pepper in. So I like a little black pepper in mine. I'm gonna add a good and decent amount of salt. I know that may seem like a lot, but remember, we've been cooking with just water and vegetables. So I've already used this. I'm pretending that I have guests coming by. If you're cooking just for yourself, you could double dip if you want to. No one's going to judge because you're the only one in the kitchen. But we're here today. And
oh, sorry.
No,
sorry
go
to
ahead.
interrupt, Chris. Do you have a specific kind of salt that you like to use?
Oh, good question.
Okay, or
I avoid table salt at all costs. Table salt to me is the epitome of what I dislike about cooking. I go kosher salt. I buy Diamond Crystal kosher salt. It's hard to find, but if you buy Windsor kosher salt, you can break it up in a mortar and pestle. If you want it a little bit smaller, you can buy pepper or salt and pepper mills as well too. But I use kosher salt because the coarseness of the grain is natural. Okay, it's got a natural coarseness to it. I'm just trying not to drop salt inside my keyboard right now. But it's not like perfect cubes. It's imperfect. And for myself, I like the flavor of it. It doesn't feel like, it doesn't leave that burn, that tang on the inside of your tongue. If I'm looking at it from a palate perspective, I go with kosher salt rather than iodized salt, because iodized salt for me, it's too aggressive. So I would definitely suggest that. Natural salts. Pink Himalayan salt, be careful with. One thing that we forget sometimes when we're getting food is how food is harvested and who's harvesting it for us. So there's always been a big, I've had this discussion with people that are strict vegans and say, you know, I'm going to eat nothing but vegetables. Be conscious of where your food comes from. who's harvesting it, because just because it may be a vegan dish doesn't mean the person who's harvesting it may not be an exploited worker or a child worker. The same goes for Himalayan sea salt. You see it everywhere and it's all over the place. A lot of people that are in compromised economic conditions are being asked to harvest the salt and being paid next to nothing for it, while large companies are making money from it. You know, with kosher salt, you're going to pay for the box, and that's because you have to pay someone a living wage. So, and most of these salts are produced in North America, so you know that the average worker at that is at least facing a decent working condition. You really want to get into salt even further, you can go all the way through, and there's a company in Vancouver Island called Vancouver Island Salt. A 200-gram box of fine sea salt is about $15. So that's roughly about this much for $15, which may seem like a lot, but the workers themselves actually have share in the company and are actually collecting more than a living wage and are receiving gratuities on larger orders as they sell. So things to consider when you're shopping for salt and all of your ingredients. I'm going to give this one more taste. That's it. I don't want any more salt inside of that soup. It's exactly where I want it to be. And then if I was serving, I got myself my ladle here that I have is a 6-ounce ladle. So 6 ounces is the appropriate size for serving soup to a guest who may be visiting your home. So if I were to take it, I'm going to bring this right down and make sure I get some of my vegetables into the bowl. So I want those to be showcased. Then I tilt my pot just a little bit and just grab a little bit of the broth. Go around. Just a little bit more. Like so. So if you're really in a pinch and you want to go really fast, you can just grab it quickly from the pot, but yeah, just like that. That's it. So simple. It's one of the easiest dishes that you possibly make. It's also the most friendly because you can control, as I said, the fat content that is existing inside of the dish. You can control the salt content that's inside of this dish as well too. So if you want it to be lower sodium, lower fat, and you're concerned about making sure that we can accommodate everybody's needs for food, whether they're dairy free, they're vegan, you know, they may have dietary allergies. This is a great way to start. And it also shows a true connection to indigenous ingredients within the country and providing you with a sort of a look into how we handle things and what we would have used during harvest to eat, especially in the fall season. You would have seen this soup way more in the fall in indigenous communities than you will throughout the summer. So you don't see this on Powwow Trail. And anybody who's ever been to a local powwow or a summer solstice festival, you'll discover that this soup is not something that's always readily available because it's considered a fall soup. There's not many powwows in the fall. So that, my friends, is the basics of this recipe. It took a little less time than I thought, but I wanted to make sure that we had enough time. Sometimes these are a little short, so we wanted to make sure that we had enough time to get questions in and comments in and discussions about this as well too. So that is the soup, my friends. I thank you so much for joining me today. I'm not leaving you. We still have some time left. If there's any other questions or statements, concerns that anybody else would like to present or ask, now is the time to do so, because you don't get these very often where you get a chef that might be willing to interact with you at all times. So please feel free. You can drop them in the chat. You can reach out that way. And I'm also going to, on here, we have the chat. I'm going to drop my email address at the college inside of the chat menu, because sometimes we forget what we wanted to ask at the moment and it comes to us later and we say, oh, I wish I would know how to get in touch with me. So it's there, and obviously I've seen it shared to the chat as well too. The document, the Three Sisters Soup document as well too. The one that is there is exactly the same one that the students work with this summer long. You'll see in the bottom that it was created, and it says May 13th, 2020, and it has no indication of how long this soup has been around. So are there any other questions, friends?
I think Brian has a question. Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, I'm just so you mentioned sumac earlier, and so like I'm familiar with, and I didn't, I know we have quite an abundance of sumac in North America, or at least in Canada, and at least around this area. But I've always been like familiar with sumac as more of like a Middle Eastern sort of ingredient that's worked with a lot. But is it naturally, is it naturally from like North America, or is that used in like many like different indigenous culture dishes at all? Or
So we see sumac around the globe, very, very much like we see cedar. Okay, so cedar
okay,
trees are highly regarded in different cultures, and in Canada we have an abundance of them. It was, I don't know, that's the thing that's always made me ponder. It's always that question of who thought it was a great idea to take bones, put them in a pot after they've been roasted to make gravy or a demi. So I'm wondering which Indigenous person first thought it would be a great idea to yank sumac down and sprinkle that on fish and discover that it tastes a little bit lemony and salty at the same time. It is used a lot in lieu of, and there are many Indigenous chefs right now, and it is climbing huge. Like I've just joined ICANN, the Indigenous Culinary of Associated Nations, this year after meeting with Joseph Schwana. But you've got the likes of Joseph Schwana, Shane Chartrand, you've got Rich Francis, we've got Cezanne Nawate, we've got Anna Cote, who's a graduate and an Algonquin alumni, who's opened her own very first Indigenous brick and mortar restaurant in Kitchigan-Zibi, and she's using sumac in lieu of salt. And she's doing a lot of twists on food combinations like Tex-Mex meets Indigenous food. We're going to do tacos the way you remember it, the old El Paso way, but we're going to focus on Indigenous seasoning and using pine bark, birch bark, and sumac combined together to give things a smoky, salty flavor, which seems so unusual to people. But when we look back at it, and we are an orally passed along tradition, but when we look back at some of the texts that are coming out from the early 1800s where things are written down, you're seeing sumac come up in Indigenous recipes. So it's something that was native to North America and is being used here in the past and is now making a resurgence as we see the acceptance of Indigenous foods coming to the table in the presentation. Because one of the things that we don't talk a lot about in these moments, and I'm always cautious when I bridge this area, is that some of this stuff was not legal to do at the time. So legislation that existed within the country, as we all know, the Indian Act dictated a lot of Indigenous interactions and Indigenous involvement in communities. So something like
so interesting. That's just like, to me, you just kind of blew my mind on so many different levels. I studied culinary at Algonquin College. I'm now back at Algonquin taking police foundations right now. So like what you just kind of brought together there just kind of really blew my mind and is unbelievable. But you're saying basically because it was such a kind of like it's surrounded by this certain culture that Canada kind of banned it as this substance that lended itself to this culture.
And that's the one thing that I always ask people when we're looking at these subjects and discussing them. Sometimes they can raise uneasy feelings, and people feeling uneasy about it is when we look to what is being asked by Indigenous communities right now, revenge is not being asked, but reconciliation and recognition is being asked. So we need to stop and really look at how that narrative is being presented and say they're asking for recognition of traditional ingredients, not it to be forcibly reinstated in an arbitrary way. It's being asked that, hey, we did use sumac. Hey, we did use pine bark. I was actually one of our bakery teachers, Jay Theoden, who was also Indigenous in our department, and I were working on a traditional recipe that we had discovered by accident, and it's using pine bark in lieu of flour. The bread that was produced from it was so earthy and unbelievable. I couldn't believe it. It floored me. I was like, where did this come from? Like, who? And he is like, apparently this was something that was done way before the days of the introduction of bannock. I was like, wow, that's incredible. So like crushing down pine bark until it became like a powder and like actually forming it in the ground in like almost like an underground oven to produce this like semi-puffed, fermented little bread. So all these things are starting to come out, and it's about reclaiming it, but it's also about sharing it. And that's why I felt this was extremely important to do today as well, too, to share with all of you that have been here in attendance today, the importance of Indigenous foods and that discussion that you can have with yourself, and also as well too paying attention to what's going on in the college that way, because you'll see it. Memo Docent Center usually in the winter puts on a Three Sisters soup, and theirs is completely different than mine because most of the folks in there happen to be Ojibwe and Cree and Huron, so you're going to see different variations of the soup. You'll see someone who says, well, I'm not using hominy corn and I like to put parsley in mine and that's it. So it was, it's one of those things where you stop and you're like, yeah, this is interesting to see, and it's about learning from each other. That's the big thing that comes about of these. And I like to share these moments where it's a teachable moment, where it teaches you a life skill and how to enjoy cooking, as someone mentioned earlier, sort of de-stressing food in your own home and making it an enjoyable event, but also sharing what we know about Indigenous culture with those that are learning and searching for those answers and trying to understand. So I think it was really important.
Thanks for that. That was just that was fascinating. So
absolutely. And it's my pleasure. I do these quite often. I do a myriad of different dishes. I do soup because it's pretty neutral. It stays within the time constraint, because one thing that I've learned about doing these is that it's sometimes hard to engage your learners. I had a group of grade 7 students who like stonewalled me throughout an entire presentation. I'm like, so are there any questions? And it was just like a grid of blank faces staring at me. And I was like, oh, this is not comfortable. I don't like, you just want to close your laptop and be like, nope, that's it, I'm done, frightened. But you've got to have fun with it, and that's just it too. And as I mentioned earlier when I was speaking and answering the other question as well too, is that it's about having fun. It's about having fun with food, and that, you know, along that way you can learn a few things while having fun. Because I mean, that's what made it entertaining. I think the joy of cooking is putting the phone off to the side and taking a minute to unplug and plug into your stove and a cutting board and like maybe a recipe that you've got and just doing it. And that to me brings me the utmost joy, and I'm happy to have shared that with all of you today.
Chris, I've got another question for you if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
Could you just quickly tell us about the Indigenous, I'm sorry, I'm probably wording this wrong, the
Indigenous Pre-Apprenticeship Program?
Apprenticeship Program. There we go. Yes, can you tell us a bit about that?
So the program was created 6 years ago by a wonderful professor in response to Indigenous education rates. The question was, why Indigenous culture and Indigenous food, and what's important about it? Why should we have a completely separate culinary program that starts and teaches Indigenous foods for people without the need for like regular culinary? And I told him, he said his response to the college was that it's our responsibility to do that. So 7 years ago, West Wilkinson created the programming in its most infant form and brought in its first cohort of 12 students. And it has garnered a lot of traction since then. As I said, I've been the coordinator for 2 years and I taught in it for 3. And I was made coordinator after West led to me to speak a lot of Indigenous food knowledge and like a lot of knowledge to share with our learners. The idea of the program is an initiative from the Ministry of Training, Learning, and Skills Development within Ontario. So it's funded not by Algonquin College, but by MTLSD. Algonquin College hosts it in its space, and we've formed that partnership together. It's a difficult task in acquiring funding. As we know, sometimes political climates change, and we see maybe a little more restrained group of people running a province versus a non-restrained group in the province. But the idea is to fund students, to teach them the skills to be competitive in the culinary industry. And that is even more important in this day and age, as we're seeing less and less people choosing culinary because some bad apples have ruined the batch for everybody else. So the Indigenous program itself was an answer to Indigenous educational initiatives at Algonquin College and was spearheaded by Wes. And I've carried that on and expanded the platform to encourage our students not just to ask of it in the School of Hospitality, but to ask of it at Algonquin College to be inclusive that way in all of its departments, not just skilled trades, more Indigenous business, more Indigenous focus on Indigenous police and police foundations, and that training that goes along where we try and bridge that gap, that broken bridge that sometimes exists between communities and law enforcement, to helping that form a partnership to work together. So we need to do that in all of our departments. So we've been doing it successfully. We're the first of its kind within the country. We've had a lot of institutions reach out to myself in the last 2 years that I've been doing this. This summer was a banner year of press for the program. It's a balance between Indigenous and non-Indigenous learning methodologies coming together under one roof to learn about culture, to learn about food, to learn about how to become employable and employable skills that I feel are lost sometimes when we're in school. How do I write a resume? You know, do I go to a resume building workshop? No, we should be teaching you that in school. And they're unfortunately not teaching that at high school level, so we need to change that. So that's what the Indigenous program was designed to do, was to help people find employment, work, and to continue to upgrade their skills. And they do it over the span of a 3-year period. So right now in my 3rd year in the program, I have some of the first students that I met in the first years of the program now prepared to write the red seals and become certified red seal chefs. That is an incredible journey to see them not be able to pick up a knife and do what I did earlier here with all of you, to now being able to do that without blinking an eye and continue to produce and being able to make this 3 Sisters soup in a half an hour unsupervised. That's a huge accomplishment to see. It's very encouraging, especially as a chef, to see I did that. You stop and there's there's a moment people forget that we as teachers are not superhumans. We're prone to mistakes too. But one of the big things that I remember was the first aha moment really kicked was when I watched a student doing that. And I was like, I taught him how to do that. And he's doing that now because I taught him. That's a great feeling. And that's the best part about the programming, is that we're constantly ever changing to meet the demands of the school and our educational values and our outcomes for our students in the School of Hospitality at Algonquin, but as well to in constantly engaging the culture. This year we had the menus in Mohawk, available in English and Mohawk. Next year it'll be available in Mohawk, Cree, Huron, Algonquin, and Mi'kmaq, because we've had many people reach out and say, I wish this was in Algonquin. Do you speak Algonquin? Yes, great. Do you want, I will buy you lunch if you translate my menus for me. And they're like, really? Absolutely. Translate the menu into Algonquin for me. Lunch is on me. Come be my guest and I'll give you credit for it as well too. On the very bottom of the menu, it will say menu produced by the Indigenous Pre-Apprenticeship Program culinary students, translated by, and you'll live a little bit in infamy in the dining room for a little while as that menu stays there. But that's just it. And that opens the door from college community to our outside of college community to build those relationships that are important for student engagement and student learning. And that to me is how we do this at the college level, and what the program is about is engaging the learners to engage the community and those around them that may not understand. People always ask the big question, is this program specifically just for Indigenous students? It's not. This year we had 2 students who are non-Indigenous enrolled in the program so they could learn about culture and learn about the history of the food and have a better understanding. And that goes right to what harkens in the TRC and what Algonquin College has been talking about with its TRC board internally, and sharing the knowledge with our Indigenous and non-Indigenous learners so there's a better understanding. We break down those barriers so that everybody understands each other, so we can all coexist happily and and have a mutual respect of each other's culture, traditions, and maybe actually help celebrate some of those too. It would be nice to see a summer solstice kicking off at Algonquin College, just as you guys are finishing up classes, to have something like that going on. Because I'll tell you right now, Buffalo burgers would sell out in a heartbeat if we had that on a fairground outside. I guarantee it. So the program was completely designed that way, and our teachers inside of it are Indigenous, so that we aren't appropriating culture. All of our teachers are Indigenous and have worked with Indigenous students in some capacity, shape, or form beforehand, whether they're learning computer skills or they're learning food theory for myself. And that helps us have a better understanding, because when it boils down to it, at the end of the day, like when people look at my bio, my home community, Kanesatake, that's where I'm from. And it fell into crisis in 91. And I grew up having to learn, no, you can't have everything, and learning that there was a difference in where I'm from and who I'm from and my culture than other people's. So it's nice to see it changing, the narrative changing. So I want to be a part of that change. I always said, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. Well, let's try and be a part of that solution and share that educational value. So, yeah.
Well, that was amazing, Chris. So thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining us. Are there any last questions, comments that anybody wanted to bring up to Chris before we leave off here today? Let's see, we have one from Renee Dixon. Do you have any food history books to recommend?
Books specific to any type of food that you're looking at, because that can span a very, very, very wide gamut.
Nothing specific, Chris. I read about bread earlier this summer and about butter. So either not one of those.
Okay, no bread, no butter. Okay, great. One of my favorite books right now that I've been surfing through, especially like when I've been looking to Asia for influence, there's a book just called China, and it is from Phaidon Publishers, spelled Phaidon. And Phaidon produces a myriad of books from around the globe: Turkey, Morocco, Japan, China. They have not just the dish, but the historical origins of the dish. So you could find a country that you like. Maybe you love the food of Italy, and they'll have a book called Italy, and there will be significant parts of history and then making reference to even further books. So it really led me down a rabbit hole when I grabbed the one that said Japan. I'm like, oh, this is great. So I started learning about the history, and it's like, read this book. So another one arriving from Amazon during the middle of the pandemic, another one. It's a plethora of books on the coffee table. So I would suggest taking a look at those always. The Gislin textbook that the school uses doesn't touch much on food history, but it does have a little blurbs here and there. But yeah, I would suggest those if you're interested in a specific cuisine in a specific country. And if you can't find something else, my email is in the chat if there's something specific you're looking for. just pull my email and drop me a quick line. I'll always respond.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
I just have one more quick question before you take off here about that program that you're speaking of, the pre-apprenticeship. It says the availability on the site's the spring 2021. So I imagine you're in that process of finishing up that program right now. Is there any like future dates set out for that?
So future dates rely a lot on ministry funding, and because of the pandemic, we've had up and down in terms of dates for the proposal. It's a 157-page proposal that goes into the ministry, and they evaluate it case by case with every school that's applying and the individuals that are applying. Having been approved last year doesn't necessarily mean being approved this year. Long story short, it'll be in 2022 will be the next cohort. So in 2021, we have run our program. It started in May, so from May 7th until the end of August. And they have gone through that. And now with the September semester, or with AC Day 1 in the fall, they've all joined, they've gone into a blended classroom to learn, furthering on some of the non-Indigenous coloring skills they've had. Their comfortability level, I find, is so much better with that pre-apprenticeship introduction. This pre-apprenticeship is an introduction to the college during the summer months when it's a little less busy, there's a little less students, and it's a little less intimidating. We all remember our first day of school. It could be a little shocking. I got into university. I went to Texas A&M in the States, and I got in, and the student population there is 73,000. It's its own city on its own. And I remember getting in the hallway, and I'm like, it's packed here. Like, where are all these people from? This gets them introduced to it and gets them understanding the importance of good study habits and moving through to improve and have like good work skills. So we do it throughout the summer months, and then we get them in September. So it's not such a shock. And now they're like, oh, you prepared us for the workload. It's not so bad. Like, I thought it was going to be way worse. And you're like, no, it's not that bad. Actually, I was harder on you than your teachers in the fall are going to be, because I want you to succeed. So that's there. So it'll be in 2022. I am 99% positive that the program, again, will see funding and a push through again as well, too.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Chris. Thanks,
No
Samantha.
problem.
And that was great. That was an awesome demonstration. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us, Brian. Yeah, thank you so much. And again, thank you so much for being here, Chris. You were amazing. That was so much fun. I learned a lot. So thank you very much. Thank you so much for joining us, folks. That's all we have time for today. But please check out all the links to our Twitter and our Instagram accounts and our event calendar, which we have lots more events coming up soon. So please check those out. And yeah, thank you so much, Chris. That was so much fun. I learned so much. It was such a good time. Bye, folks. Have a great rest of your day. Bye, Chris.
Bye. Bye. Take
Later.
care.
Bye.
Bye.